I uncovered every secret from the last 30 years.
And I have given all the proofs of who was involved with Diddy. I have presented the videotape of Diddy's parties as evidence. Now no one can save Diddy and the other celebs. Jay-Z, after watching the rest of the documentary, you'll understand everything.
Today changes everything. Not because of a rumor, not because of a tweet, but because a brand new Netflix documentary has arrived that claims to show material the public has never seen before. And once you understand what's being presented, it becomes very clear why this moment feels different. For years, people believed the story around power in the music industry had already been told. They thought everything important had surfaced, that whatever happened behind the scenes had already been discussed, debated, and buried by time. But this documentary doesn't come in loud. It doesn't open with accusations. It opens with context. And that's what makes it dangerous. Because context doesn't scream. Context connects. What's being shown here isn't framed as a sudden reveal. It's framed as a missing layer. The documentary claims there were clips, recordings, images, and moments that existed long before headlines ever caught up. Material that didn't fit neatly into the public version of events. And instead of saying this proves something, the film does something more unsettling. It asks why these things were never placed side by side until now. That's the key difference. Individually, moments can be dismissed. Together, patterns start to form. The documentary positions itself as a continuation, not a correction. It suggests that what audiences saw before may have only scratched the surface, not because the rest didn't exist, but because timing matters when power's involved. When stories surface too early, they disappear. When they surface too late, they feel irrelevant. But when they surface at the exact right moment, they force attention. And this moment is carefully chosen. What's especially striking is how the film avoids direct statements. Instead, it lays out sequences: who was present, what environments existed, how certain relationships overlapped, and how often silence followed moments that might have deserved explanation. The documentary doesn't accuse, it observes. An observation, when done patiently, can be far more unsettling than any allegation. Halfway through watching, something becomes clear. This isn't about shocking viewers with content. It's about reframing memory, about asking the audience to revisit things they already know, but without the gaps, without the years in between, without the comfort of forgetting. Before we go deeper, make sure you like the video, subscribe, and hit the bell, because this story is moving fast, and what comes next builds directly on what you're hearing right now. What makes this release hit harder is who it involves and how cautiously the information is presented. The documentary repeatedly reminds viewers that influence doesn't need to announce itself. It operates quietly, through access, through proximity, through environments where nothing is technically said, but everything is understood. And when footage, audio, or images are shown within that framework, they don't need to be explosive to feel heavy. They simply need to exist. The most uncomfortable part isn't what's shown, it's what isn't explained. Why certain moments were allowed to pass without clarity. Why questions stopped being asked. Why silence consistently followed the same pressure points. The film doesn't rush to answer those questions. It lets them hang. And by doing that, it pulls the audience into a different role. Not spectators, not jurors. Observers of a system that relied on time doing the work instead of truth. This is why people are reacting so strongly. Not because the documentary claims to expose secrets, but because it challenges the idea that nothing was hidden at all. It suggests that things weren't buried. They were simply never connected. And once you start connecting them, the story doesn't feel explosive, it feels intentional. That's where this begins. Once you settle into what the documentary is actually doing, the tension shifts. It's no longer about shock, it becomes about realization. Because the film doesn't rush forward. It moves backward, retracing moments people thought were already understood, then placing them back into context that was never available at the time. What stands out immediately is how deliberate the pacing feels. Nothing is dropped randomly. Every clip, every image, every recorded moment is introduced with restraint, almost as if the documentary is testing how much the audience remembers, and how much they were never encouraged to question. The film doesn't say, "Here is the truth." It asks, Why did this never become part of the conversation? That question changes everything. When familiar names appear, they're not framed as villains or heroes. They're framed as constants, always present, always nearby, always part of the same environments. And that consistency is where the discomfort begins to build. Because coincidence can explain one overlap. It struggles to explain a pattern. The documentary repeatedly returns to the same idea. Power doesn't need secrecy to survive. It needs normalization. It needs moments to feel ordinary when they happen, so no one thinks to look back later. That's why the film emphasizes timing. When footage was captured, when recordings were made, when images existed versus when the public ever heard about them. There's a subtle but powerful suggestion being made that some material wasn't hidden because it was illegal or explosive, but because it would have raised questions too early. Questions that would have disrupted careers, alliances, and narratives that were still being built. And the film makes it clear, this isn't about one night, one clip, or one person. It's about environments, spaces where influence operated quietly, rooms where people felt protected by proximity to power, situations where silence wasn't fear, it was confidence. What's unsettling is how calm the documentary remains while presenting this. There's no dramatic music cue telling you how to feel, no voice pushing a conclusion. Instead, the audience is trusted to notice what keeps repeating, the same faces, the same circles, the same absence of explanation when moments pass that seem, in hindsight, unfinished. At a certain point, you stop waiting for a reveal. You start watching behavior, how people speak, how they don't, how narratives are framed just wide enough to feel complete, but never wide enough to include everything. That's when the weight sets in, because the documentary isn't asking viewers to believe something new. It's asking them to reconsider something old, to look at history not as a series of isolated events, but as a carefully managed flow of attention. Where stories weren't erased, they were spaced out until they lost urgency. And urgency is dangerous to power. The longer you watch, the clearer it becomes that this release isn't meant to close a chapter. It's meant to reopen memory, to collapse distance, to make moments that once felt harmless sit next to each other without years in between to soften them. Nothing explodes here. It tightens. And when a story tightens instead of exploding, it doesn't go away when the screen goes dark. It follows you. It lingers. It makes you rethink what silence actually meant and who benefited from it most. As the documentary continues unfolding, something subtle but important happens. The focus shifts away from what is shown and toward what was never explained. That's where the tension really starts to build. Because the more you watch, the more you realize this isn't about shocking footage. It's about patterns that were allowed to exist without interruption. The film keeps circling back to the same environments, the same kinds of gatherings, the same social spaces where influence moved quietly, without headlines or accountability. These weren't secret locations hidden from the world. They were open rooms filled with powerful people, where nothing felt urgent enough to question in real time. And that's exactly why those moments survived untouched for so long. What makes this uncomfortable isn't accusation, it's familiarity. Viewers recognize the faces, the names, the era. These weren't outsiders slipping through cracks. These were central figures moving confidently through systems that never required them to explain themselves. The documentary doesn't rush to connect dots. It lets the audience do that naturally, by showing how often the same energy appears across different years and different situations. There's a moment where you realize the silence wasn't passive, it was active. Silence functioned like insulation. It kept questions from gaining momentum. It allowed narratives to continue uninterrupted. And once you see that, the past doesn't feel distant anymore. It feels structured. The documentary uses restraint as its strongest weapon. And instead of telling you what to think, it shows you how often opportunities for clarity appeared and quietly passed. Interviews where answers stopped just short, stories that ended without conclusions, moments that should have been revisited but never were, not because they were resolved, but because time was trusted to smooth them out. And time usually does that, until people stop forgetting. This is where the viewing experience changes. You stop consuming. You start observing. You notice how calm everything feels, even when it shouldn't. How confident silence sounds when it's backed by reputation. How distance replaces explanation so effectively that no one even notices what's missing. The documentary never claims this proves anything criminal. That's not its goal. Its goal is far more unsettling. It exposes comfort. The comfort of knowing you don't have to explain everything. The comfort of believing attention will move on. The comfort of silence doing the work instead of truth. As the layers build, it becomes clear this story isn't driven by new revelations. It's driven by old ones finally being placed side by side. And when that happens, coincidence starts to feel strained. Patterns begin to speak for themselves. What lingers most is the realization that nothing here had to be hidden to be protected. It only had to be left unfinished, and unfinished stories don't disappear. They wait. By the end of this section, the audience isn't asking what happened anymore. They're asking something far more dangerous to powerful systems. Why was nothing ever fully explained? And once that question takes root, it doesn't fade. It deepens. As this section unfolds, the documentary leans into something even more uncomfortable: memory. Not dramatic revelations, not explosive accusations, but the act of remembering things people were never encouraged to hold on to for long. Moments that felt minor when they happened. Interactions that passed without follow-up. Images that circulated briefly and then vanished from conversation. The film quietly challenges the idea that nothing happened simply because nothing was said. It reminds the audience how easily unfinished moments are dismissed when they're surrounded by fame, success, and momentum. When careers are rising, questions feel inconvenient. When influence is strong, silence feels like confidence. What becomes increasingly clear is that visibility and accountability don't always travel together. Some people are seen constantly, yet rarely examined. Their presence is normalized, their access unquestioned, their environments treated as untouchable simply because they've existed for so long without interruption. The documentary doesn't frame this as a conspiracy. It frames it as habit, a system that learned early on how to protect itself by never forcing closure. Conversations drifted, stories softened, attention moved on, and every time it did, the structure grew stronger. You begin to notice how often context is missing. Not erased, just absent. Clips are shown without commentary, letting viewers feel the discomfort of realizing they've seen fragments of this story before, just never assembled this way. The power isn't in what's revealed, it's in what's resequenced. The audience starts connecting eras that were previously kept apart. Early success, peak influence, later controversies. When those phases are no longer separated by time, the narrative feels different, heavier, not louder, heavier. Because weight comes from accumulation, not shock. There's also a noticeable shift in how authority is presented. No one rushes to defend, no one rushes to explain. That restraint once read as dignity. Now it reads as strategy, a quiet confidence that time would continue doing its job. But time behaves differently when people stop forgetting. This is where the documentary becomes unsettling. Not because it tells you what to think, but because it removes the comfort of dismissal. You can't brush these moments off as isolated anymore. They sit next to each other. They echo. They repeat. And repetition is never accidental. The film keeps returning to the same idea. Silence wasn't the absence of response. It was the response. A response chosen because it worked, because it didn't provoke, because it didn't demand resolution, because it let narratives continue uninterrupted. By now, the audience isn't waiting for a smoking gun. They're recognizing a structure, a way power learned to manage attention without confrontation. And once that structure becomes visible, it doesn't collapse. It tightens. The tension grows not from what's being said, but from what still isn't. From realizing how many chances there were to clarify, to address, to explain, and how consistently those chances were bypassed. This part doesn't escalate the story. It stabilizes it. And that stability is far more unsettling than chaos, because it suggests this wasn't disorder. It was design. At this stage, the documentary stops feeling like a story being told to you and starts feeling like something you're slowly realizing on your own. The pace remains calm, almost patient, but the implications grow heavier with every sequence. Not because something shocking is introduced, but because nothing is corrected. What stands out now is how often power relied on familiarity. The same circles, the same social gravity, pulling the same people into the same rooms, decade after decade. When something repeats long enough, it stops being questioned. It becomes part of the background. And background is where accountability goes to disappear. The documentary doesn't accuse anyone directly. Instead, it keeps doing something far more effective. It shows continuity. Moments that were once treated as isolated now sit next to each other without explanation. And once that happens, coincidence starts to feel uncomfortable. You notice how often situations were framed as misunderstandings rather than moments needing clarity. How narratives were allowed to fade rather than be finished. How silence was never broken because it never needed to be. The structure was already working. This is where the idea of normal begins to collapse. Normal isn't defined by what's right, it's defined by what's repeated without consequence. And the film quietly asks the viewer to consider how many things were accepted simply because they'd been accepted before. There's also a growing awareness of how protection operates, not through threats or force, but through reputation. When a name becomes big enough, it shields itself. People hesitate, questions soften, curiosity gets delayed, and delay over time becomes erasure. What's unsettling is how disciplined the silence feels. No emotional outbursts, no defensive reactions, just distance. Distance from context, distance from explanation, distance from responsibility. And distance works until people start measuring it. This is where the audience's role changes. You're no longer watching to see what happens next. You're watching to see what doesn't, who engages, who avoids, who addresses context and who never does. That absence becomes part of the narrative. The documentary doesn't demand outrage. It cultivates attention. The kind of attention that doesn't burn out. The kind that tracks patterns across time. And once attention becomes steady instead of reactive, silence loses its advantage. By now it's clear this isn't about uncovering something hidden. It's about understanding why so much was allowed to remain unresolved. Why stories were never closed. Why clarity was always postponed. And postponed long enough, questions don't disappear. They stack. This part of the documentary doesn't add new weight. It reveals how much weight was already there, quietly waiting for someone to stop looking away. By this point, the story shifts in a subtle but important way. It's no longer centered on what was shown. It's centered on why certain things were never challenged when they first appeared. The documentary slows down here, almost deliberately, as if giving the viewer space to think instead of react. What becomes clear is how influence doesn't just protect actions. It shapes perception. When someone controls rooms, timing, and access, the narrative doesn't need to be rewritten. It just needs to be delayed. Questions don't get answered. They get pushed forward. And pushed forward long enough, they stop feeling urgent. You start noticing how moments that once felt random begin to line up. Not because the film tells you they do, but because time finally allows them to sit next to each other. Old interviews, old footage, old reactions that suddenly feel different when viewed without the pressure of hype or loyalty. This is where the idea of credibility quietly enters the room. Not credibility as in truth versus lies, but credibility as in who was allowed to speak freely and who was never asked to explain anything at all. Silence becomes a privilege, and privileges are rarely accidental. There's also an unspoken theme here about how power doesn't always need defense. Sometimes it survives simply by being familiar. When people grow used to seeing the same faces in the same spaces, accountability starts to feel disruptive instead of necessary. That's when systems protect themselves automatically. The documentary doesn't accuse, it observes. And that observation becomes uncomfortable because it removes excuses. There's no chaos, no emotional music pushing you toward a conclusion, just structure, repetition, patterns that don't explain themselves, but don't need to. At this stage, the viewer realizes something important. The real tension isn't about what might be revealed later. It's about how much was already visible before anyone decided to look closely. The pieces weren't hidden, they were scattered. and scattered things don't draw attention until someone gathers them. This is also where responsibility subtly shifts outward. Not to blame the audience, but to involve them. Once you've seen patterns, you can't unsee them. And once you notice silence, you start recognizing where it's still happening. The film understands that outrage fades quickly, so instead, it builds awareness slowly. Awareness lasts longer. It changes how future moments are interpreted. It forces context where there once was none. By the end of this section, you're no longer asking, what's going to be exposed next? You're asking something far more unsettling. How much has already been seen and simply accepted because no one stopped to connect it? By now, the pressure isn't coming from new information. It's coming from perspective. The way earlier moments feel heavier once you understand how carefully everything was framed. This is where the story stops being about shock and starts being about weight. You realize how timing was used like a shield. Certain clips aired when attention was elsewhere. Certain voices spoke only after moments had passed. Not because the truth wasn't there, but because momentum protects more effectively than denial ever could. What's unsettling is how normalized it all felt at the time. The industry didn't freeze. It didn't push back. It kept moving. Awards were still handed out. Appearances were still made. Smiles still showed up on camera. And that normalcy did more damage than any headline ever could. This section forces you to confront how power operates quietly. No threats, no warnings, just access, invitations, silence. When everyone benefits from keeping things smooth, rough edges get ignored. And ignored long enough, they disappear from conversation entirely. You start noticing the absence of reactions, moments where responses should have followed, but didn't. Situations where clarification was expected, but never asked for. Not because people didn't notice, but because noticing out loud comes with consequences. The documentary doesn't rush here. It lets discomfort sit, because discomfort is the point. If it moved faster, you might miss how intentional the pacing really is. Slow enough to think. Slow enough to remember how often similar patterns showed up before. And that's when the audience becomes part of the equation. Not as spectators, but as witnesses. Once you see how influence softens scrutiny, it becomes impossible to ignore how often that same process repeats across different stories, different names, different eras. This isn't about proving something new, it's about recognizing something old. The way power reshapes reality by controlling what feels familiar, acceptable, and untouchable. The way silence becomes routine instead of suspicious. By the end of this stretch, the tension isn't loud, it's internal. You're no longer waiting for a reveal. You're sitting with the realization that the most effective cover was never secrecy. It was comfort. And once comfort sets in, the hardest thing to break isn't a story. It's the habit of looking away. This is where everything shifts. Not because of a new clip, not because of a leaked recording, but because the story finally stops pretending these moments were isolated. Up to now, it's been easy for people to say, that was years ago, or that was taken out of context, or everyone already knew that. Those phrases worked because nothing forced them to sit next to each other. Time kept the distance. Memory stayed fragmented. But here, that distance collapses. You start seeing how the same names keep appearing at the edges of different moments. How the same rooms, the same energy, the same silence repeats itself. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, consistently. And consistency is where coincidence runs out of excuses. This is the point where the documentary stops asking you to react and starts asking you to recognize. Recognize how often explanations were promised later and how rarely later ever came. Recognize how narratives were redirected instead of resolved. Recognize how power didn't need to erase anything. It only needed to let time stretch long enough for people to stop asking. What makes this the turning point is that the silence finally gets framed as a decision, not an absence. When moments are replayed back to back, you feel it. The pauses, the careful wording, the way answers end just before they become uncomfortable. And suddenly, it's not about what's shown, it's about what was always missing. You realize that the real protection wasn't secrecy, it was familiarity. The comfort of seeing the same faces, hearing the same tone, trusting that nothing serious would ever be addressed directly. That comfort trained the audience to accept gaps as normal. But once those gaps are lined up, they stop feeling harmless. They feel intentional. This is where the pressure changes shape. It's no longer fueled by outrage. It's fueled by awareness. Awareness that silence kept working because no one treated it as evidence of anything. Awareness that time was used as insulation. Awareness that power doesn't rush when it knows attention will eventually move on. Except this time, it didn't. The audience stayed. And staying changes everything. Because when people stop chasing shock and start tracking patterns, the story can't reset anymore. It doesn't matter what comes next. The lens has changed. Every new appearance, every quiet response, every non-response now lands differently. That's the moment this documentary creates. Not exposure, not accusation, recognition. Once recognition happens, there's no going back to watching passively. You don't need someone to tell you what to think. You feel the weight for yourself, and weight doesn't fade quickly. This is where the narrative locks in. Because from here on out, silence isn't neutral. It's loud. By this point, the question isn't what will be revealed next. It's who can still pretend they didn't understand what they were watching. Because once the pattern is clear, every previous moment gets re-examined. Old interviews don't sound the same. Old jokes don't land the same. Old denials feel thinner. What once passed as confidence now reads like calculation. What once felt casual now feels rehearsed. This is where the pressure stops being external and becomes internal. Viewers start replaying moments in their own heads. Things they brushed off, things they laughed at, things they told themselves were just industry stuff. And the uncomfortable truth settles in. The system didn't survive because nobody knew. It survived because knowing didn't feel urgent. Until now. What makes this section hit harder isn't volume, it's restraint. The documentary doesn't shout. It lets the silence stretch. It lets familiar faces speak in ways that suddenly feel incomplete. And in those gaps, the audience fills in what they already sensed but never connected. That's the shift. This isn't about exposing a secret anymore. It's about exposing a habit of deflection, a habit of waiting things out, a habit of trusting that attention will always move on before accountability arrives. But attention didn't move on. And once attention stays, power loses its favorite shield. Time. You can feel it in how the story slows down here. Not because it's running out of material, but because it wants you to sit with what's already been shown. To realize that nothing new is required for the picture to make sense. Everything necessary has already been there, scattered across years of public moments. This is the realization point. The moment viewers understand that the most effective form of control isn't force, it's normalization. When behavior becomes familiar, it stops being questioned. When silence becomes routine, it stops feeling suspicious. When narratives repeat long enough, they feel permanent, until someone rearranges them. That rearrangement is what breaks the spell. From here on, every response will be measured against this new awareness. Every appearance will be scanned for what's avoided. Every statement will be weighed not by what it says, but by what it refuses to address. And that's the real turning point. Because once the audience starts listening for what's missing, the story never sounds the same again. By the end of this, what lingers isn't shock, it's clarity. Because when everything slows down, when the noise fades, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. This story didn't explode overnight. It unfolded quietly over years in plain sight. The only difference now is that the silence around it finally broke. What you're left with isn't a single villain or a single moment. It's a system that relied on distraction, on fame being louder than questions, on success being used as a shield, and on the assumption that time would bury everything before anyone connected the dots. That assumption failed, and once it failed, the balance shifted. Now every move is watched differently. Every absence speaks. Every statement is analyzed not for confidence, but for avoidance. The industry that once closed ranks feels less solid. The distance between power and accountability doesn't feel as wide as it used to. This isn't about celebrating anyone's downfall. It's about understanding how long certain stories were allowed to exist without challenge. And why? Because when attention finally stays focused, it changes behavior. It forces explanations. It exposes patterns that can't be dismissed as coincidence anymore. And it reminds everyone watching that influence without oversight always leaves a trail. What happens next won't be decided by one documentary, one clip, or one voice. It will be decided by whether people keep asking questions when it's no longer trending, whether they remember what they saw once the headlines shift, whether silence is allowed to return, or whether awareness becomes permanent. That's the real test. Because history shows that exposure only matters if memory lasts. And now that the story is out in the open, the only thing more powerful than what's been revealed is what the audience chooses to do with it. Stay watching, stay aware, and don't let this be the moment that fades quietly into the background.